Welcome back to the Marshall Modification Project. My name is Austin, and I'm joined by my co-host Dan. And we're joined here today by Ed Sokolowski from Mirror Profiles. How are you doing, Ed?
Hi, guys. Yeah, doing well. Thanks for having me.
No worries.
Thanks for coming along. I guess we should probably do a little bit of responding to some of the comments. Quite often we let the interviewee chat a little while, and we'll be doing that with Ed as well. Our system is that we're academics, and we're really interested in what our interviewees are saying, and this isn't really so much of a conversational thing as it is, we really want them to talk and for us to listen. So just FYI, we're not going to be shooting the breeze. This is kind of a bit more of an academic approach to interviewing. So apologies for anyone in the comments who finds that a little disappointing, but it's our style, man.
All right, good stuff, Dan. All right, cool. So, if people have been watching the channel before, they'll have seen that we've been interviewing a lot of modders. So we are Dave Friedman, Mike Saldano, and so on. And for the next few episodes, we're going to be looking at people who are capturing those amps. So capturing those amps for things like Tonex and Kemper and Quad Cortex and so on. And Ed has captured a lot of Marshalls, modded Marshalls, or commercially available amps that are kind of based on modded Marshalls. So we think he's going to be a really interesting person to interview about that. So Ed, we're just going to ask you a sequence of 10 questions, really. And the first one is hopefully pretty straightforward.
Before we go too far, Austin, sorry to interrupt you. Tell us a little bit about yourself, Ed.
Yeah. So I actually work in music professionally. I'm a mixing and mastering engineer as my day to day. So I came, started off as a failed guitarist and worked with bands and kind of realized that they wanted me to record their songs rather than to play guitar with them. So I became the guy that was recording, all the local bands. And over time, that's kind of spread into different genres. And most of what I actually work on now, it's rare for there to be even guitars on there. There's a lot of pop and dance music. I've still very much got an interest in the recording side of things, especially with guitar amps and working with bands. But I guess with my work, it's kind of moved to mixing and mastering. So,
you've got a bit of a history with Marshall amps as well, don't you?
Well, yeah, I'm in Milton Keynes and I've grown up here. So the Marshall factory is 10 minutes away from here. And there's a couple of big companies, and I guess they're one that's, been here since the very beginning. So it's very, you grow up seeing the Marshall font everywhere and around you. I think when I first...
Sorry, carry on. You were saying?
Yeah, when I first started playing guitar, we had a family friend who got wind that I was playing guitar, and he was a personal friend of Jim Marshall's. So he'd arranged through Jim for me to have a tour of the Marshall factory, which I've done it more recently since, and probably appreciate it more now because you kind of get more of a grasp of the scale of things. When you're 12 or 13 or whatever I was at that age, everything's so kind of overwhelming that it's hard to appreciate how kind of unique the experience really was. But I'm sure that definitely stuck with me, and you kind of build this connection to a particular company because they're local. You see the people working there. I think at that point, all of just every single Marshall amp was still made in Bletchley. They didn't have the Vietnamese factory yet. So, I was probably aligned with Marshall anyway, but especially when you have an experience like that at a young age, it does kind of affect your loyalty towards a brand.
It can't be kind of well enough stated as well that it's such an interesting thing in this day and age that the original factory is still there, has expanded, and still makes amps in the UK. It really hasn't, even though some of the more consumer level amps are getting shipped overseas now, the main bulk of the Marshall amps we know and love are still made there. And I kind of often forget that we talk about the modification of this original product, and then we were Austin and I were having a chat earlier about you were chatting about your JCM800, and that the irony of doing all this modded project is Austin's 800. He doesn't want to mod it.
Yeah. I mean, it's amazing to see because as well they're not kind of shipping in pre-made parts at all. All the wood comes in completely unprocessed. All the metal work's done there. It's not really how anyone can make amps these days if you're starting an amp company. And most of even the ones made in the UK, they're not doing it to that extent. So it's kind of a precious thing that I hope they can, continue to make it work and continue to build things like that. Because, if we're honest, it is very much of its time in a period when they were probably making many more and selling a lot more amps than what a factory in England can sort of justifiably do now without having it all in place already.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
So Ed, how did you get into capturing amps then? So you told us a little bit about your background there. What started the capturing, profiling side of these amplifiers?
Definitely had an interest in guitar amps as a guitarist. I guess with my interest in recording as well, like the gear and the technology is always something that's appealed to me. I've always kind of loved the fusion of music and the technical side of it as well. So I had a few amps, and I guess like many people going back a few years, he sort of dabbled in and out of digital and mixed reactions to it, I guess, as well. So went down that rabbit hole, decided no, I'm all about amps, and for recording, let's try and not compromise too much. And then I had some friends who were doing fairly big records, and they kept telling me, oh, you've got to get a Kemper. Trust me, Kemper's it's really good. It's different to the other digital stuff out there. And I was so dismissive for years of it. I was just not ready to even give it a chance, really. And I'm not sure really what changed me, but eventually I thought, right, I'll give them a go. I'll see how it pans out. I think more and more producers that I looked up to were kind of using them as well, maybe. So that might have had an effect. That it was just the direction things were going in. And as soon as I got that, there was no looking back, really. Started capturing amps. As soon as I bought that, actually, I might have had 3 or 4 amps before the Kemper, and after that, it's just kind of got completely out of control. So I think it actually led me to buying more and more amplifiers and getting more interested in them and how they work, how they behave. Even when it didn't capture right, it would make me want to understand why and work out what the differences are between them.
Yeah.
And I think with hindsight, I've kind of, I guess, gained more perspective with what digital's good for, what it's not good for, where we were back then, where we are now. And it's kind of, the goalposts are always moving with this stuff. And even in the last 6 months, the technology is evolving and changing, and it moves at a very fast pace. So I think what was happening in 2016 seems a very far away point from where we are now, which is crazy to think about. Yeah.
So you said 2016. That's roughly when you started, I guess. What amps did you sort of start profiling initially when you began? And was there any reason that you chose them? Were they just around, or was there any particular reason that you wanted to profile these specific amps when you started out?
Yeah, so the amps side originally were just the ones I had in the studio that I was using regularly with bands. So I was kind of buying and selling things, but the ones I'd hang on to were the ones that were making the cut on most records. So they were kind of very meat and potato amps, JCM800 or JMP and a 5150. Maybe I had a rectifier. Very, very kind of very much amps that end up on a lot of records rather than the more unique, kind of obscure ones, which definitely came later. So yeah, it started off with those for sure. I think as well, my original plan with the Kemper was, my intention was always to just record direct with it and then reamp through the amps afterwards, just to get that little bit extra. And quite often we just became attached to the sound, as we were going, and it just didn't make sense to deviate from that. But originally the appeal was, I'm all in the same room as everyone in here when we're recording, and you don't really want a loud amp blasting. So to have something that sounded like the tone we were shooting for, and to have it at a convenient volume, recallable, that was all very appealing back then. And essentially those criteria are still valid now. They're big helps, if you have to be in the same room as an amplifier for 12-hour days.
Yeah. So that was the original kind of motivation behind getting into this, was kind of like to solve a problem, right? Or a practical solution that was mainly for your recording work, so you could kind of track at a lower levels, and you had a consistent tone and kind of so on, right? And then you says you got attached to that tone. What do you mean by that? Did people actually, did the players or yourself actually start to like the sound of the profiled amp, and they didn't want to deviate from it, or can you just elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, maybe to an extent, although I always think with a Kemper there was always an audible difference. So you'd have to adjust a few things and just kind of make it work. And I think rather than fighting against the accuracy at this point, it was more just, if it's lacking something, just fix the problem and kind of keep moving. So sometimes it would be that. Sometimes just as you're working on a production, as the song evolves, you just need to change little things as you go, and it may end up deviating from what the amp sounded like originally anyway, and it just suits the song. So rather than having to go back and recreate what's working, you just build it in and just run with it. And there's a lot of benefits just working like that, just to kind of keep moving forwards and try not to look back too much if you can help it, unless there's a real reason to. So I think a lot of it was just, working at speed, trying to get things done, and do whatever it takes to get the sound we were looking for.
So initially, then, it was, as I say, to kind of maybe solve a practical problem, and you were profiling the amps that you had available and so on, and that was maybe your approach earlier on. How did the approach change? When did it change, and how did it change, to what you're doing now? So tell us a little bit about that journey.
Yeah, it's a good question, really, because I haven't consciously thought about it too much. It's very organic how it's kind of gone from a tool that I was using in the studio to something a bit more than that. I guess with the Kemper, I found that there's a lot of learning to do as far as the technology and how it all kind of works. And I guess I realized some of the deficiencies with the way the Kemper worked, where I didn't like the process of capturing a full rig, with a cabinet and microphone. And I found the impulse side of the Kemper, it uses really short impulse responses. So the way it recreates the low end is a bit of a hybrid technique that, let's just say, is a bit less than ideal. So I kind of found a preference for capturing amplifiers direct. So either using a load box or using a cab and then tapping a DI from the amp, and then applying impulses after the fact outside of the Kemper. And I think if I was still to use a Kemper now, that's the approach I'll take with it. I just generally prefer just let the Kemper do the amp side of things, and when it comes to mic position and cabinets, you're not stuck with a single choice that is going to disrupt the whole tone. You can fine tune it and hone in on what you're going for a lot easier. Because I really don't like the approach of a long list of hundreds or thousands of really vastly varying tones. If you change the speaker or the mic, the tone's going to change drastically, and the last thing you want to do is sit there going from just wild extremes from one to another with no kind of logic behind the journey you're going between them. So I very much had this process of preferring to use my own impulses. And I think around the same time, it was when I really started to learn about load boxes, impulses in general, which I still think there's not the greatest kind of public understanding of exactly how best to use them for micing up cabs. Everyone has their own approach with it, and even between a lot of the bigger people making them, they each have their own processes with it. So let's blame the pandemic with having a bit too much time on my hands. I did it with some friends who do recording as well, and I guess we did the same sort of journey together, and we were all trying different techniques of capturing amps, capturing cabs, sending tests to each other to listen to A/B tests and blind tests and all sorts, and just trying different techniques. So essentially, so we could capture our amps and cabs and have the same tone as when we'd mic them up normally. And that journey essentially led me to really have to understand how the load works, why different load boxes sound different to different cabs, the way impulses were captured. It's kind of got a bit better recently, but going back then, a lot of people were making impulses through valve power amps and having that interaction between the load and the amp bakes into the IR. And even a lot of primitive amp sims didn't have power amp modeling, and they were kind of expecting the impulse to have it built in there. So this kind of stuff hadn't really been standardized too much. And I kind of went on this journey to be able to recreate the tones I was getting when I was in the studio, micing cabs up, to being able to do that, using impulses and modelers. And over time, we kind of figured out a technique for capturing speakers that, is indistinguishable to how I normally mic things up, and was totally happy with it. And I had some friends doing the same technique, and we all were all really thrilled with the results we were getting. And it was around this point where, I started becoming more convinced of how good modeling has got these days. So going from someone who was a total skeptic to the technology and just thinking there was always something a bit lacking with digital, to thinking, oh, it was actually me that had to learn, how the power amp responds, depending on what load it's going through, is going to affect things a lot. If you use an impulse that isn't captured properly, or you're doubling up on certain interactions, it's going to veer things away. And there's a lot of pitfalls that you can get tripped up in that I think probably still happens a lot with a lot of people, but you just need to know these kind of areas to watch out for if the goal is to recreate, the real sound of the amplifier as you'd get in a studio environment. And I remember quite vividly, I must have had a pod years ago as a teenager, and kind of sworn off Line 6 a bit after that, after a lot of years of using it, to good effect. But I'd been out of the loop with their stuff, and I remember trying Helix and being able to recreate. I've got the Friedman here, and I had my Friedman mic'd up through my cab, as I would in the studio, and I was able to recreate that sound just using Helix and an IR without any kind of using any of my gear there and then. It was all pre-captured. And I could tell that, the technology is actually a lot further than I realized, but it took my kind of understanding of working out how to make my amp sound like their one as it's been modeled, and understanding the way the impulse is going to interact with it. And I think when that happened, then I was way more convinced that the gap that I thought was there with digital and real amps was much smaller than I realized. And the main problem was understanding how to take advantage of it. So yeah, it was definitely a long journey of kind of, coming from a point of trying to get the results I was looking for to solve a problem. And in order to do that, I had to learn the technology in order to solve those problems and kind of work out how much of it was actually user error that was holding me back. And I guess from there, that actually did lead into me wanting to understand why the amps, how they behave. Because, I'd seen these terms, negative feedback and bright caps and things to do with the circuit. And when you're trying to isolate different variables and things that affect what you're trying to do, then it helps to have more of an understanding of these things. So yeah, it was definitely, going from digital modeling, that made me more interested in real amps and the circuits and understanding how they work.
That's really, really interesting, Ed. It sounds like you've went through quite a sort of journey and a process and trying to enhance your understanding, and that creates this feedback loop of wanting to learn more and feeding into the digital side of things, the analog side of things. But you've touched on it a little bit, but I'd be interested if you could, I know there's not just one way to do this, but maybe you could pick a more generalized example, or maybe a couple of examples that represent two different approaches. How do you actually go about capturing an amp? Tell us a little bit about that process, from capturing it right through to you actually release it and start to kind of sell it. What are the key steps that you go through? You don't have to give away any secrets here, but we want to just understand the whole process.
Yeah. No, I wish there were secrets, and things would be a lot easier because there'd be a defined process with it. Everyone has their own take with it, so I have my perspective on what I'm trying to achieve with it, and other vendors will have a different criteria for what they're trying to achieve, and I don't think there's any single right way for it. My approach is I'm very studio orientated. I'm all about kind of making music and having something to show for it at the end. I'm not really a live player. I'm not really someone who wants a tone necessarily to play through for rehearsing or practicing or anything. My goal is very much, let's make music, let's make songs, let's make a production. And my feeling is those are the tones that we fall in love with and that we aspire to hear and that we want to play through. And I think if it sounds good enough for an album, then that's inspiring to play through if we're not doing that. So the goal is always that, even if the use cases kind of deviate from there. Similarly, with the going back to the Kemper approach of capturing the amp DI, that's kind of stuck with me ever since. So I don't offer full rig captures. I just don't like the process of being locked into one specific mic position and speaker. For me, that's far too important to kind of constrain everything else to. And a lot of amps, I don't tend to touch the EQ that much very often. Sometimes it will live in a very similar area, and the biggest change will be changing to a different cab, changing a different microphone, moving the position a bit. That's really the tool I want to hone in on a tone. So all the impulses I sell, capturing the speaker across the full width of the speaker, all with various mics. I capture all speakers inside the cab. And that to me is essential to have, because that's what I need when I'm in the studio. I'm going to try all the speakers. I'm going to find the one that works best for the given project. And given the convenience of digital, that's not something I want to give up on easily. So I'll go in with that mindset that it's going to be amp only. I'm probably going to account for different speaker types, different microphones. From there, I really have to spend time with the amplifier and understand what it's designed to do, how it's designed to work, what its unique characteristics are, and just get a feel for that. So I won't dive into making any captures of it until I really have a feel for what it's good for. And for some amps, there might be an association with a band or a particular guitarist or something that it's very known for that might inform the direction I'm going to go in with it. Sometimes it's something that's extremely rare, and I've got no idea myself what to expect from it. And you can read very conflicting things online. And in those situations, you just have to, maybe I'll research and just see if I can recognize anything in the circuit to understand what the intention is, what they were trying to do with it. Other times I'll just play it and just see what inspires me. And I guess once I've got a feel for how it behaves, maybe how it interacts with certain cabs or certain load boxes, where the master volume likes to live, what controls might have a big impact on it, then I'll start thinking about dialing some tones in that I'd want to record with. And I'll typically just try and come up with a few demo ideas or write some music with it and pick up different guitars and different tunings, just make sounds that have a kind of purpose that belong on songs, and find things that are just kind of working and inspiring me. And as I go, I'll just make these captures, and I don't always keep all of them, but I'll just kind of catalog things as I'm going like that. And I guess after a while, you get a sense of this covers the whole amp, or we're just scratching the surface here. There's a lot of switches and modes and things to explore still. But yeah, the last thing I want to do is make redundant captures, either because it's treading the same ground as something I've done before, or if they're just things that don't really represent what the amp's good for in the first place. There's lots of amps that have very basic clean channels and features that if you're playing live, you absolutely need. But in the studio, you're not really going to go towards. You're going to go for something else for a particular clean sound, or, you're going to use one amp for typically what it does best and use your kind of freedom of choice to pick the best option.
What about, you were touching on some of the stuff that we got in the next question, so I'll not follow up with those now, but obviously, this is around Marshall mods and modded Marshalls and so on. I'm just interested to know if, when you're capturing, let's say, I think you did a gel, didn't you? So you did like a gel modded Marshall. When you were doing that versus just, let's say, a kind of stockish JCM800, was there anything different in your approach? Were you approaching that in a different way, knowing that it was a modded Marshall, or were you just doing it the same thing? Was there any different mindset in that capturing process?
Not particularly. I guess once I start making the sounds, it doesn't really matter too much to me whether it's a Marshall or what its origin is. At that point, I'm just trying to do what that amplifier does best, what's connecting with me sonically. Except for maybe because I know that it's derived from a JCM800, I might try and dial some tones in that evoke that feeling to me with it, which I guess is part of the amp's DNA anyway, so I might have done that regardless. But if I'm kind of making something that I'm marketing as a modded JCM800, I'll try and make sure that there's some tones in there that represent that JCM800 tone. But beyond that, to be honest, if it's designed to sound different, I want to lean into what makes it unique, what those mods are there to do, and to take it in those directions. And if someone wants a stock 800 sound or a stock JMP 203, then I offer those as well. So there's a less need to tread exactly the same ground. I'd rather go beyond and into the unique kind of territory of it.
Could I just dig in a little bit on one of those points as well? So modded Marshall that's supposed to be doing a thing versus original Marshall, what are the differences you're picking up when you're creating a capture?
It really it depends. I've not had that many 800. I've had maybe 5 or 6 50 watt, 100 watt 800s and JMPs over the years.
That's quite a lot.
And it is, I guess more than most, but some people go totally crazy on it and get through a lot. But
like one.
But even out of the stock ones, they all tend to, as we know, have different tolerances, slight different revisions over the years, and have aged differently, and they all have their own charms anyway. So even when I have stock amps side by side and they sound different, I still want to try and lean into what makes this one unique to the previous one. So I guess a big part of it is just spending time with the amp and identifying what the kind of unique characteristics of it, if it's a bit stiffer feeling, or if the gain kicks in a little bit earlier and the bright cap behavior affects that differently, or one of my favorite ones has 6 CA7s in it, so the power amp's slightly different, and I might try and just expose what that does to the amp a little bit more. And the same philosophy applies with the kind of modded ones, where I'm just looking for those things that separate and distinguish it against other amps that are out there.
Is there a specific modded one that you could give us an example of?
I mean, the JL mod one's quite a cool one. So obviously that comes off the back of Jason Tong kind of popularizing those mods and giving kind of attention to it. I know we had the Friedman model, I think, was released before then, but it was really Jason doing these amazing explanations of the circuits and what can be done with the amp, which made it a lot more easy for someone like me to follow along, who I've never gone inside an amp with a soldering iron. I don't trust myself to do it safely. So I love understanding the technical side behind it, but I'd much rather someone who's comfortable doing it is doing the actual work. And with the Jake Lee-modded amp, so that was actually my amp tech's own personal amp, and he had it modded as, I think as soon as he bought it, he turned it into a 204 because Marshall weren't selling a 50 watt 800. And because he's got the means to do it, he just bought a 1987 and just changed the preamp into a 2204. So he had that, and then I think he'd watched Jason's video and implemented the Jake Lee mods, and he'd done it so each of the tweaks he'd put on a switch, so he could go between the stock 800 sound to the Jake Lee mods and anything in between. And he had it like that and was in love with it. He brought it over to me. He'd done some work on some other amps and said, "Oh, here, try this out." And that kind of sold me on the circuit. But because I already had several 2204s and 2203s, I just didn't need to be able to go back to that sound at all. So with that amp, I had the idea of, let's just commit the Jake Lee mods to the circuit, put those in, and we'll use the switches for other mods that I had ideas for. And a lot of it was just kind of thinking about what the circuit has, what makes sense, what's simple to do with what's in there already. There's no point trying to turn it into something far beyond what it's designed to do. It was just kind of trying to find things that might offer something that makes sense with an 800 style amp. So there's a fat, well, I called it a fat, but it's just one of the coupling capacitors. It's going between 2 different values. So one lets through a little bit more low end than another. There's a 3-way bright switch on there. It's a very common kind of thing to do on Marshalls anyway. There's one that's called Boost, which is really an attenuation. I think that is in the stock circuit anyway, because there's quite a lot of gain that goes through, and I think it's to kind of tame oscillations, but I can just have it on without it oscillating or misbehaving. So the boost mode is essentially without the attenuator in there, and then we can drop it down for the kind of traditional Jake Lee mod. Then there's a sat switch. We put a 3-way, which again is quite common for modders to do on amps, to have symmetrical and asymmetrical clipping. I think there was one remaining switch on the front because we put a negative feedback switch on the back. I love rectifiers, so I grew up, late 90s, early 2000s, where the rectifier tone for me is kind of how generations before me speak about the Van Halen kind of tone, or Hendrix, or 80s tones. For me, is the rectifier is so much the music I grew up with, and even if I don't necessarily listen to it now, it's the kind of, that was just on every record and the sound that I kind of aspire to. So having the negative feedback on a switch where you can bypass that, it gives a kind of rectifier-ish influence to it, which is quite a nice personal thing for me to have on there. And then there's a depth control as well, which again is fairly common mod to have on like a modern amp.
Just to take us through, and you can do it quite quickly. Assume that we're idiots, which we might be. Can you just talk us through the process of profiling an amp? But can you tell us what variables do you think have the most impact on what you're doing, and maybe perhaps are unique to what you do? Maybe give the mirror profiles a unique character that's different than other vendors.
I guess a very large part of it is I came at it from the impulse side of it first, and when I was using amps and load boxes and wanting to make sure that when I'm recording an amp with a load box that it sounds exactly the same as when I'm miking the cab up with no load box at all, I wasn't happy with impulses until I was able to achieve that, and that was my starting off point. So having impulses that I could verify and that I was totally happy with was essential for me before I even got to any kind of modeling stuff. This is using analog equipment. So I'm very much coming at it from this point of having impulses that I know how they work, how they're created, what to expect from them. From there, I have several different load boxes, and behind the screen there's several cabs there as well. So I'd like to think I'm very aware of the different loads used, and I try and use real cab loads as much as possible, but often there's times where I can dial things in a little bit with a bit more finesse when it's going through a load box, because I can hear what I'm doing in the moment a little bit better. And for certain amps, I'll only use a cab. Rectifier is a great example, where if there's no negative feedback, the sound of that amp is so dependent on the load it's going through that if I go through a load that doesn't sound like a Mesa cab, it's not going to sound familiar to what people expect with it. So there's technical aspects like that that I'd like to think I'm fairly aware of, that might get overlooked by, I don't want to discredit. There's loads of gear out there that's great and has different uses and different ambitions, and for what works in certain environments might be great there and less applicable for other ones. So some load boxes just don't really sound accurate to the load of a cab, and for playing at home and for a lot of uses, that's not going to be a problem. It's just a slightly different tone from the amp. For what I'm going for, where I'm really trying to recreate this original reference point, then I'm very particular with how they behave. And if I am going to use a load box that sounds different, that's going to have a very specific reason as to why I'm going for that approach, where there might be a certain sound that is just valid, and it's not necessarily a real tone that you'd get through a cab, but it's doing something that's cool. But I'd say generally it's that kind of understanding of the power amp and cabinet interaction, the negative feedback, pairing them up with IRs that are going to play nicely with it, and that you're going to get a tone that is indistinguishable to what it's going to sound like mic'd up. And from there, that kind of feeds back to where the master volume's set, where the power amp controls are set. To me, the master volume is almost like a global tone control, especially when you're not in the same room as the amp, and volume is just another kind of knob that's on the amp. If you're using a load box or you're not subject to the loud volume, it doesn't really matter where it's set. You're just using it as a tonal kind of tool. And For many amps, that's the kind of, if you get that wrong, it's going to totally skew the way the amp sounds to someone else's taste. So there's a lot of amps where I might not even touch the tone stack that much, but the master volume is the kind of place where I'll be adjusting the tone from, because it affects the headroom of the low end, the headroom of the top end, how much kind of sizzles in there. If you really have it blasting and those are getting pulled down and there's a lot of mid range there, then I'm going to set the mids totally different on the amp. So there's a kind of things outside of the typical amp controls that might influence where I actually set the first ones.
Just quickly,
sorry.
Marshalls. Because how do you find that? Because Marshall master volumes to me are almost unique in this as to how influential they are.
Absolutely. Again, it's somewhere it's been helpful for me to learn the different implementations of master volumes and where they are in the circuit and what to expect from how they work. So if we take the vintage modern, or I had another cool kind of old 70s JMP, the 2150, which I think they only made about 500 of, and that has a similar master volume topology as the vintage modern. And it's kind of like a post-phase inverter master volume where, as you turn it down, the presence is going to have less influence over the sound. And generally, you want to set those pretty high for the amp to kind of feel and respond as it was designed to do. So the higher you can get those set, generally the better. Although the vintage modern does have some cool tones when it's set lower. With something like a 2203 or 2204, to me, they're kind of voiced around having the master volume lower, which is still far too loud for most people. But with that, I don't typically like the sound of them much above. I mean, definitely not above 6, rarely even above 5. 4 is kind of typically about as high as I'd use it. I might include some that are higher just because some people ask for it or have slightly different tonal preferences to my own personal tones. But for my kind of personal taste, I like having headroom. I like hearing lots of bass come through, having lots of punch, having a wide kind of taper of the top end rather than it folding back in and not having room to bloom out. So typically with a 203, the master might be around between 2 or 3, and it's kind of it's similar for a lot of amps that have derived from the 203 circuit. Something like a rectifier 5150. I don't really tend to set the master volumes on those that high either. I like the sound when they're lower than what people might think.
What's interesting has just popped into my head, and it's really quite interesting, the conversation that a load box changes the function of the master volume to an extent, doesn't it? I mean, the master volume without the load box is really volume first and tone kind of second, but with the load box, volume's out of the equation and it almost becomes a tone control, as you say, which is a really interesting way of looking at it. When you're capturing maybe modded Marshalls, I'm just interested to know your thoughts on this. And when we spoke to a lot of modders, one of the initial motivations behind mods was to get a cranked sound at lower volume. So kind of arguably part of the modded sound is at lower volume, right? With the master volume down low and get into the distortion and the gain from the preamp. Do you find that ever factors into what you're doing, thinking, okay, this is that going into my next question, which is like, how do you know these captures are right? Do you think that whenever you're capturing or profiling a kind of modded amp, that you're factored in, right, well, a lot of these players will actually probably keep the master volume down quite low, because that's why a lot of people have bought that amp to get to get the sound of the cranked amp with the master volume down low. I don't know if you have or you haven't, but have you ever thought about it that way?
Yeah, it's definitely interesting because it's kind of gone full circle on what the mods were intended to do in the first place. And I guess with lots of technology where it was designed to do something to achieve a certain goal, and the imperfections of that approach have been the thing that we've fallen in love with, which happened countless times with recording technology over the years. You can even just look at tape machines as an example of, they weren't trying to have a sound or to do anything other than recreate the source perfectly, but the thing we fall in love with is those imperfections with it. And so much gear has been like that over the years. And I guess load boxes have definitely made it easier to have that cranked sound without needing to resort to kind of getting the gain in the preamp or using clipping stages or or different approaches. So I guess the use of, when load boxes got much better with the kind of Aiken design, it's allowed us to, if you want a cranked tone at a convenient volume through captures, you can just capture it. And even if you don't use a load box at all, you only have to withstand, 5 minutes of a training signal while you're in the room as it blasting away. And then you've got a repeatable sound of an amp that isn't going to blow up. The valves aren't going to tire. It's going to behave in a predictable, recallable way. And you can have a perfect cranked sound however you like. So then the mods that are trying to recreate that become just tonal options that might not sound exactly like that, but they have something that we like about it. So it might be a certain compressed feel. It might be that you get a bit more low end than what an actual cranked Marshall is capable of doing. Or you can combine mods in a way that just isn't really possible on a stock 1959 circuit. So rather than becoming something that is there to approximate a cranked Marshall, they just become tweaks for the sound that can just be used creatively. And I guess for me personally, I'm not thinking about the cranked sound as much as the aspects of the cranked sound that we like. Why would I be cranking up in the first place? It might be because it changes the way the notes feel under the finger, a certain compression thing, a certain voicing to the mid-range. It might be that I want the low end to not take over too much, or I want to control some fizz. I'll be thinking in those kind of ways rather than let's just make it sound like this kind of reference amp.
Yeah. So, I mean, the next couple of questions are kind of interrelated, and then I'll hand over to Dan for some questions. So this is kind of down like to the evaluation. So you've captured these amps. How are you evaluating? What is it you're listening for or feeling? I mean, can you talk us through that process? How do you evaluate that you've got a good profile and it's accurate? What is the kind of evaluative process that you go through, Ed?
Yeah, it's a kind of tough question because at a certain point it comes down to personal taste, and everyone is going to have their own preference on what a good tone is to them. And then when you factor in that everyone has totally different equipment, they're using things in totally different ways. They might be using a solid state power amp in a cab. They might be using studio monitors. They might be using headphones. There's a strong likelihood that they're not using my IRs. They might have their own IRs they like using, or just a collection of different ones and their own approach with that. They'll have different guitars, different pickups, different tunings, all kinds of variables that I'm not in control of. So to a point, I have to dial in what I think sounds good. And then what I personally do is I'll go through every guitar I've got, and I have them all set up in different tunings anyway, just for studio use. So I can grab things and have them kind of intonated and ready to go. So I'll just try and use, as much different gear as I can with it, and just make sure that I'm covering ground where it still sounds good. And the same goes, I've lost count of how many cabs I've captured over the years, but all different speaker types and different mics where I'll try and test things with as many different variations of those where it will still sound good. And if I load up a certain cabinet, or if I use a certain guitar and it doesn't sound good, I'll redial the amp to make sure that I can get something that works for these different tunings and different speakers. And quite often I'll get to a point where I can change between different captures, I can swap guitars, and there'll be something that works for the different guitars that I've got. And at that point, I kind of know that I've hit the point of diminishing returns. With anything else I make from here, it's going to sound like something already made. So there'll be enough in there that covers everything. And it's really a fine balance between, I don't want to offer just endless lists of sounds that are the wrong sound, essentially, because the more options you have, it's just more that are going to be wrong. There needs to be some element of curation in there, and something that's a bit more focused with it, that if you're looking at this amp in the first place, you have a rough idea of why you want to use it and what to expect from it. So I'm trying to lean into what distinguishes each amplifier. I do offer some clean sounds with a rectifier, say, as an example, just as an amp that can do a lot tonally. But I'm not going to obsess over those sounds over the kind of red channel, modern mode, bold tones that are in there. In the same way that with a 2203, I'll do some with the low input and the master cranked, but typically I'll kind of do the sounds that I think of from a JCM800 rather than just what it's capable of doing.
And whenever you're checking you've got your profiles and you're evaluating them, are you going back to the originals and A/B between those? And if you are, what are you listening for? What are you feeling for? Again, what's the process to evaluate those between the originals and the profiles you've captured?
So I'll typically have the amp set up in a recording setup, and it'll be very much in the moment of when I'm dialing things in, listening back to it with a real amp. And when I'm happy with how the real amp is working in a track, that's when I'll decide to capture it. And I'll record the real amp and the capture, and I can verify, very quickly there and then that it's doing the thing that it's supposed to do.
Can I just jump in? You said in a track. So when you capture, are you profiling your amps in the context of maybe you've got a track that you think that sound would fit into? Is that something you do? Because that's quite interesting.
Yeah, not all the time, because it's a lot to write. I'm not. I wish I had time to kind of just write songs that prolifically, but I do write a lot of. I have to make demos anyway to show my products, and I'll try and do them in some kind of context. So it's not just something that kind of sounds good in isolation but has no actual use beyond that. The goal for me is that they need to be able to work in a full production with drums and bass, and to communicate music. That's kind of the intention that's always there for me. So I'll always try and do it in the context of a song. It might not always be that, but I'm definitely recording it and listening back to it at the very least. It's not just me playing through, oh, this sounds quite cool, and capturing that. It needs to be played back at me and sound, comparable to something I mixed. Something I will actually do quite a lot is, say if there's a band that I'm trying to kind of hone in on their sound, I'll reference against their tracks and I'll just flip between them and just make sure that it's doing that thing with a particular, I'll always have to use a similar IR and, speaker and mic arrangement to make sure that it's sounding similar. But if say there's a VH4 and I'm trying to hone in on Tool's guitar sound, I'll make sure that it can do that, referenced against their track. And funnily enough, to go back to what I was saying when I had this kind of experience with the Helix, when that sounded really accurate to my real amps, I can't remember how I stumbled onto it, but I realised with the IRs I'd made, I could recreate these guitar sounds from famous recordings, and so much of it was a lot more simple than I ever realised, where they were guitar sounds I'd kind of dreamt about and thought were totally unobtainable. And it kind of dawned on me that it was actually not that hard once you had the right recording setup with it. And so many of these great guitar sounds and records we've grown up with that are done in LA studios, those studios cost $1,000 a day, and they don't have time to spend ages and ages honing on a mic position. So a lot of the time they'll throw a 57 up, they'll throw a 421 up and a 121 up, and rather than move the mics, they'll blend those. So loads of the tones I was recreating, it was just a case of finding the balance. You'll find the right speaker and right microphones and then balance those. And it was surprisingly possible to get these tones once you knew the right speaker to pair up with it. So that was something I started offering on the website of Bullet For My Valentine tone, or Kill Switch tone, or Green Day tone, Tool, all these kind of albums I've grown up with. I never thought I'd be able to make my guitar sound like them, and not only to do it with the amp, but also because the modeling's so good that any of these platforms can recreate as well, so long as the recording, the microphone and the speaker part of it's right.
Yeah, cool. I'm just laughing that you said about because obviously we teach recording, and we get students doing all sorts of things, testing out microphones around speakers. But it's funny the point you make about these expensive studios that they'll probably just put it at, just half on, midway between the speaker cone and actually blend the microphones, because they just don't have the time to sit and fiddle around and find the perfect point. They'll just instead do that. It's just it's an expedient way to do it. Sorry, Dan, I only asked a question, but can I just ask, can you give us an example of a profile that you think really nailed it, and maybe also one where you just couldn't get it right? And if possible, can you think about the Marshall modded amps you've done? What was the process where you knew you got it right, and maybe something where you struggled, and what were you listening for and feeling? Maybe you could give us some examples.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, this is an interesting topic as well, I think. So if we go back to the Kemper, I think that always had some deficiencies in the sound, but for a long time that was the only option. And a lot of the time, those deficiencies either weren't too much of a problem, where you could overdub a guitar part and you wouldn't really be able to tell where it's been punched in if it's filling in a certain section, or you'd just accept that it sounds slightly different and lean into that, and you'd still get a result that was passable. And I remember with the Kemper, I had a Selmer treble and bass, and it's kind of, not too dissimilar from a JCM45 circuit, kind of old school, early 60s amp design, should we say. And I was doing the direct Kemper profiles, so no cabinet or microphone on there. And the Kemper really struggled with that. I think when there was a lot of power amp distortion, the way the Kemper makes models, which is kind of using an underlying kind of generic amp sound and applying pre and post filters to that. It's kind of crude way of doing it, which depressingly works quite well to a point. But yeah, that really struggled with the Selmer treble and bass. And similarly with amps with a lot of preamp gain, PV Triple X, JSX, and Crank, like Revolution and Frankenstein, that would get all kinds of messages from the Kemper of, remove noise gate when there's no noise gate in the circuit. It just couldn't work out what was going on. It couldn't really distinguish between noise and, I guess, the hiss from the preamp. So those kind of pose problems, and sometimes you could find ways of making it work, or you just have to accept that you need to do it with a cab or adapt how you capture it to do it. With the more modern kind of neural network approaches, it's kind of different because they just operate in a different way, and the differences with those are maybe more similar to, it's almost how I think of things like an Axe-Fx or a Helix or Quad Cortex, where over time you become familiar with what their sonic character is and where they can sound different to a real reference amp. And I guess just through the way my brain works, I just have to learn. I'm obsessed with learning things and understanding them. So I love digital gear, and I don't really see them as replacements for real equipment. I love kind of both equally, but I have this goal of that, if I can't make a modeler of any platform sound good, it's down to me to understand why and to figure out how they've done it. They use teams of very, very smart people designing them. And I know that in their lab conditions, they've designed it to do a job, and that they wouldn't put it out unless it was meeting those criteria. And a lot of these companies are well established and been doing it a long time. So I'm not going to be arrogant enough to assume that they're wrong and I know what I'm doing. The likelihood is more is user error, and it's up to me to figure that out. So I'd spend a lot of time with the different modeling platforms and work out where I'm going wrong with it and what I have to learn to be able to get the results that I'm looking for with it. And over time, you do learn the sonic character of each one. So, as much as I was talking up the Line 6 Helix, I think there is some giveaways in how they model amplifiers and their approach that does kind of reveal it as a Helix model over a fractal model or something that I've captured. And it's not always a bad thing, but if you know where to look, you find that. And I think it's the same thing with Fractal and Quad Cortex. And similarly with Tonex and NAM on the early versions, there's slight differences, typically in the low end or the very top end. And capturing those dynamics right, even now, I think it's closer than it's ever been, and it's really impressive, really good. I don't think it's ever really going to matter, but I also wouldn't say it's exactly the same yet. There is a difference that if you know where to look and you really focus on it, like it is there. But I would say the instances where that's going to be a problem are negligible at best. But yeah, for me, it's just sort of knowing where to look for each platform, and if you know that it's going to struggle with something, to maybe not test it too much in that area and focus on where it's going to represent the amp in the best way. If it's going to struggle with lots of power amp distortion and it doesn't sound that good doing that anyway, then I'm not going to make a whole pile of captures doing something that it can't do particularly well. But yeah, it really depends. But I think things have got a lot easier with the more modern platforms where they can just reproduce a lot more complex inputs with a lot more predictability and consistency with what comes out. I think Kemper, you could have these sessions where you profile something, and even if you didn't change anything on the amp, the results would come out differently, and then you'd have to go through this refining process where things can just go in any direction, which you can't really predict or control. And these modern platforms don't really have issues like that. They'll give a result that sounds very similar each time you do it, with their own aspects that you have to be aware of, that can affect things. Although they tend to be more technical things. It's kind of got to a point where you have to more be aware of how much your noise floor is affecting the input. So those kind of models really struggle with. It comes around to the modded amplifiers quite nicely, where if you're modding a Marshall to have just maximum amounts of gain, your noise floor is going to struggle as a result. Where if you've only got a couple of valves that are providing all the gain, you're on that verge of oscillation and lots of noise where it's hard to control. And typically models don't like having a lot of noise. So in those instances, you might need to go through a lot of valves to find the quietest ones. Anything that brings that noise floor down is going to help give a more accurate and more satisfying model to play through. Whereas other circuits and amps might not be as fussy. If there's not a lot of noise there anyway, if they're not generating a lot of gain from the valves, they'll typically come through a lot more accurately anyway. I think gain on the modern platforms is the more gain there is, the harder it is to get a result that really closely matches it. Maybe between that and if there's complex dynamics with it, the Uberschall's a great example of that, where when you play that for a cab, there is just that interaction that happens between the power amp, the speaker, and the way you play guitar. It affects how you're going to control your palm mutes, how much low end you're going to push into the preamp, and it's a kind of active system that you're trying to separate when you make a model. And I think that's one of the hardest amps to really capture the low end in an accurate way. I mean, there is just something to be said for the real gear and being in the room with it and responding to it there and then. As soon as you start trying to separate these variables, it's just inevitable that there's going to be some kind of loss. And, the skill becomes how do you minimize those losses and variables that are inherently there.
Ironically, I think you probably answered most of the question that I was about to ask.
Yeah.
Because the things about what are the hardest things to translate in the capture, I think you've probably covered that pretty well. But I want to think about translation and representation of sounds. As record producers, we spend a lot of time listening to mic'd up guitar cabinets. And we think about, I think we think about sound as sort of a schematic representation of what's coming through. We don't think about it like someone who's standing in a room with a guitar. But how do you think about how your sounds translate to your users who might be using FRFRs, or they might be using studio monitors, or even a traditional guitar cabinet? How do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually something that's kind of worked back in a nice way for me doing just direct models only. So my preference is to use impulses anyway. I think if you can use whatever impulse loader you like, there's certain workflow advantages where things can be organized in a fast and convenient way rather than having to use a built-in one in a modeler. And typically you can have, an unlimited impulse length for the impulses you're using. So they can be whatever sample rate, whatever fidelity you like. You're not constrained by a hardware platform with that. So in offering direct models, it does mean that if you want to run that into a power amp, you might be doubling up on power amp distortion there, but I think the trade-off isn't too bad. There's other variables that are going to skew it away from accuracy anyway at that point. So you might just have to adjust your presence and depth settings a bit and just sort of fine-tune to whatever output medium you're using. And then typically if they're using a full-range speaker, FRFR or studio monitors, that's typically going to work nice anyway with impulses. So that should play fairly well. Similarly with headphones, they're attempting to recreate a kind of full range experience.
Mm.
And to a point, you know, I kind of have to let go of, I can't control how users are going to use these things. And even if I could, what sounds right to me might not sound right to them anyway. So once it's in their hands, they have the freedom to take it in the direction that suits them.
Do you get
I
feedback?
think sorry?
Do you get feedback from the users?
From users? Usually it's if they want specific settings from an amp, which I'd say more often than not seems to be less about how what I've provided sounds and more, we love this guitarist, these are his settings, can you just recreate this so I know that I've got what his settings actually are.
Right.
So to me it's kind of can be somewhat redundant, because I think how you dial it in and how it actually sounds, you're better off making it sound like that guitarist rather than just copying the settings one to one. You don't know what their pot tolerances are, how it's been serviced over the years, what revision the amp is,
Or
all these kind of variables. So I you know, I'd rather let the sound dictate the direction of the captures rather than looking at numbers or other people's settings or anything. But I'm totally cool with, I think that's something as a vendor that is unique that I can offer, that I'm happy to, if someone wants to send me a DI, I can dial it in for their specific guitar and their tuning. If I'm not capturing or representing an amp in a way that they would like, there is that possibility of dialing it into their specific requirement and doing that. So it is something that I've always told customers I'm happy to do, and surprisingly very few do it. The most common request for something that I don't provide is they'll send a photo of a famous guitarist settings and ask if I can capture it at that. And 9 times out of 10, I've already provided it in there.
Yeah, I was thinking about the Rick Beato conversation about how a guitar tone isn't just the speaker, the cabinet, the microphone, the head. It's also the Neve preamp, the tape machine, the EQ that was put on post. And I don't know about you, but trying to get recall off a board, I can set the EQ the same the next day and it doesn't sound the same.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So it's always interesting that someone looks at the knobs on a guitar cab or on a guitar head and just goes, that's the only setting that's relevant.
Yeah. It's a moving target all the time. And even our own perception and taste, if we don't have a good night's sleep the night before and our ears just might be that bit more sensitive to a particular frequency that wasn't bothering us the day before when we'd started in the afternoon and things were quieter or what have you. So, you know, our ears aren't perfect, let alone inconsistencies with voltage and just gear acting different depending on, you know, temperature and things that we're not necessarily in control of with it. I think just fundamentally, you know, when I'm working on music, there's all the technical stuff around it, which is extremely useful to be aware of, but it shouldn't be the thing that dictates the process of what we're doing. Ultimately, we're making music for a reason, which is to get an emotional response out of people. And, you know, the technical stuff is all well and good, but it needs to give something at the end that inspires people to want to play or to do something or to achieve something out of there. So, you know, it's like learning a language. You learn all the kind of rules of how to communicate, but we're not thinking about those when we talk to someone. There's a kind of emotional aspect to it of trying to get across what we're trying to do. And I think of recording in that same way, where you have to know the technical stuff so it doesn't trip you up, but the less you can be thinking about it when you're in the moment, the better it's going to serve you.
Yeah, fluidity.
Absolutely.
So who do you think the captures are for? Like, what sort of customers do you have? How do people use them, and why has your understanding of those users changed over time? Let's maybe just start with who do you think they are, and then think about change later.
Yeah, I mean, as much as I'd love to be all encompassing, I think within reason, I try and stay within my limits of what I know I can do and what I have a kind of taste for. And I think largely it's going to be the stuff that, you know, we all grow up with. So the kind of the music I grew up listening to and this shapes my taste, they're typically going to be the tones that I dial in naturally and that I go for. So I do try and go a little bit outside of that. You know, I love music anyway, and love tons of music that came out before I was even born. So it's kind of, it's not like I'm only fixed on a specific era, but there is, I guess, an overarching kind of similarity between the type of amps I tend to gravitate towards and the sounds I go for. So a lot of the stuff
behind you, really.
Yeah, it's a lot of like higher gain stuff, which it's funny because it's not really the music I listen to now, but it's the kind of, they're the amps and guitar sounds I dreamed of as a 15-year-old guitarist. And I mean, to an extent, the kind of that era, the kind of tail end of recording budgets being huge, I still feel like that was just a kind of golden period where there was money to put into making great sounding albums, and there was just like a kind of great environment to be making recordings that sounded incredible. And since the budgets have dropped, people have perhaps got a bit less inventive and less ambitious with the tones they're going for. So I definitely have this kind of nostalgic feeling towards that late 90s, early 2000s, big budget, kind of LA studio focus on things. Anything that's kind of past then is still trying to recreate that a bit. And I guess on a kind of more personal, from a more personal perspective, loads of what I learned about recording, going back 20 years or so, information was a lot harder to come by, and to find people that could teach you, to show you a kind of process of how to record. And Andy Sneap's forum was one of the only places online where there was kind of working professionals giving, for the time, really good advice. And loads of what I learned about guitar sounds and micing up is because I loved Andy Sneap's productions and wanted to recreate his sounds. And over a long period of time, I had to learn that you can have the same gear and do it in the same way, and if you don't play guitar as well as a top guitarist, then you're not going to sound as good as them. And it kind of forces you to look inwards at what affects a guitar sound, and the equipment and the amps and the mics and speakers and everything is only one component of it, and the human part of it is a much bigger part of that.
I think that's a really great aspect of how your taste shapes it. But do you think your taste and your customers' tastes have some sort of reflexive relationship there? Is there something there where your taste informs them or their taste informs you?
I'd love to say that their taste informs mine, but typically I think it's just I have to put something out that I'm confident in, and if other people like that, they'll tend to come back as repeat customers. And I think the people that tend to like my products, they just like how I dial things in. So if they like one amp model pack that I've made, then they're probably going to like all the others. I think it's kind of like if you're making a song, you can only really make what inspires you, and if other people connect with that, then you're doing well. I think if you try and please other people, then you're not fully behind it, and it's probably harder for people to feel as passionately about it. So I don't want to sound egotistical, but I guess I'm only trying to impress myself, and I know if I'm confident with it, other people will have a similar response from it. And some people might not like that at all, but I think it's best if I just try and kind of satisfy my own needs, and other people will respond to that. And typically that's how it's gone. I think maybe the one surprising kind of pool of customers that I hadn't really considered that maybe doesn't fall into that is we're in a climate now where cover bands are everywhere, and that's kind of, if you go to local venues, that just seems to be what a lot of people want to see when they go to see live music. So there's a lot of cover bands now, and lots of them seem to like I have a 1976 super bass that's modded to the Adam Jones spec that Dave Friedman posted online years ago, and all these tall cover bands love being able to buy captures from an amp that's based on the circuit that Adam Jones is using, and that I've dialed in using a similar cab load, IRs using similar mics to what Adam uses, trying to recreate those tones. And I think it's actually really cool that they can access this stuff that is someone spent the time to really hone in on a sound that serves them, and they have, for a cover band, they actually have very fixed parameters on what they're trying to achieve, that I can probably guess what kind of guitar they're using, what kind of style of riffs they're going to be playing, what kind of context they're going to be using it in. And it actually makes it quite easy for me to provide them something that is going to suit those needs. So a surprising amount of the kind of artist-centric tones have an audience of cover band users. And occasionally, like I had a couple of guys who are in Rush tribute bands, and Rush is just a band that's kind of gone over my head completely. I'm aware of who they are. I've heard the odd song here and there, but I wouldn't claim to be a kind of super fan who is really adept at dialing in their tones and achieving the Rush sound. So I haven't really tried to cater to that yet, because I wouldn't feel comfortable putting my name on something that, you know, that I'm not fully familiar with. Which is a bit of a shame, because I have, it's one of my favorite Marshall amps I've got is a 4140 Club and Country, which is famously Jim Marshall's least favorite amp they ever made. Nothing to do with the sonics of it, but because it cost a lot to make and failed pretty spectacularly. So as soon as Jim Marshall saw the figures of it, that instantly made it his least favorite. But that's an amp where I've made some profiles of it, or captures of it, that I think sound incredible, but I wouldn't be able to say whether or not they cover Rush's use for it, because I don't know the specific songs or context that Rush used it on. And I'd really have to dive in deep to be able to cater to that.
Great. So, I mean, we kind of already established a little bit that you have a kind of an amp preference, you know, looking at the wall of amps behind you. But also, like, are there any categories that you like to capture that you haven't?
I guess the ones that I have captured, like Marshall, are so available and they have the kind of personal thing for me. So that tends to be why there's so many more Marshalls than everything else. You know, they are just everywhere. You can find good deals on them. There's kind of interesting variations between them. I feel like I would absolutely love Matchless amps. Whenever I play digital versions of them, I've never played a real one, so I don't really have any expectation on what to expect, but every single model has just blown me away, where I feel like that's an amp where I'll just fall in love with the real thing. So if I was a rational adult, I'd sell some of the amps I don't use so much and just go all in on experiencing a Matchless. So I'd love to try those a bit more. A lot of the Vox kind of orientated stuff I just need to dive into. I guess the main reason I've been hesitant to is I don't typically associate them with 4x12s, which is kind of where my preference is and where all my cabs are, all my impulses are. I'd really just need to dive into, I mean, even a lot of boxes do use Celestians, but you kind of have to just be aware of other cab types, other speaker types, other recording approaches. And then there's all the different circuit revisions, the different companies that have owned Vox over the years. It's a deep thing for me to dive into, which maybe at some point I'll do it, but it wouldn't just be that I go out and buy the first AC30 I see. I'd have to research the different circuit variations and really understand what I'm capturing and what to expect out of it.
Yeah.
There's definitely some boutique, expensive amps that are just very uncommon in England. And
Vox is almost a bigger rabbit hole with the JMI period than Marshall.
Exactly. And there's even the ones that Marshall were building for Vox, which are pretty well regarded, actually, in the 90s.
Yep.
I said that Vox Korg are based in Milton Keynes as well. So, you know, if I'm going to have some kind of brand loyalty to Marshall for being local, then there should at least be a little bit with Vox and Korg being here, because, you know, I don't know if you guys how familiar are with Milton Keynes, but it's not known as a place for kind of creative. You know, it's got a reputation as a very soulless place where things don't really happen, and anything that is a bit unique and kind of involved in supporting art, I kind of want to get behind those being here, because if they don't get supported, they go. And you know, it's quite cool that there is, you know, Black Star aren't too far away, Marshall are nearby. There's is it Steve Keats of Origin Effects that's fairly local. We have kind of, there is stuff around here that I kind of feel inclined to support and want to see prosper. And you know, to bring it back to the capturing, If I go off my own experience where getting involved in captures has made me more passionate about amps, I kind of hope that customers have a similar mindset with it, that making models and captures of amps, it serves a certain need and is very convenient and oftentimes is the sensible choice to use, but
Then you fall in
it's
love.
not the same thing as using a real amp and using real cabs and real mics and being in a room with something. And it's really important as users to be aware of all the different approaches and what's going to work best in any given situation, and not just to sort of land on, oh, I've got this pedal, so I don't need this anymore. They just do different things in different contexts. And I think the more as guitarists and engineers and musicians we have an understanding of those different approaches and technologies, it serves us better to just treat them as their own thing.
So you're the gateway drug, is what you're saying?
I think so, yeah. I need to, it's happened to me, so I need to pass it on to other people as well.
I think I recall the reason I bought an 1176 was because UA put out their 1176 suite, and it was the first plug-in where I kind of went, oh, now I get the 1176 thing. Oh no, now I want one.
Yeah. And I think it's no different really with studio gear and with guitar amps, where when I'm working, I'm predominantly in the box. When you're dealing with changes and different projects overlapping, I don't want to be constrained to kind of the pitfalls of hardware and how much slower it makes printing stems and bouncing mixes. But I think modeling has got so good, but there's something to be said for the tactile approach of putting your hands, where you use both hands, you're listening, you're adjusting, you have meters that are giving you visual information back. You listen and interact with the gear in a totally different way to what you do with digital equipment, where I was going to mention this earlier, actually, when we were talking about the master volumes. If we're playing a real amplifier and you're plugging in and turning it on, the kind of process you go through, the very first thing you do, you plug your power cable in, speaker cable from the amp to the cab. The first thing you do is you're going to turn the master volume down so you're not blowing your head off as soon as the amp power's on. So it's like the first control that you're shaping the tone of the amp with. So you turn it on, you'll turn it up a bit so you can hear what you're doing, and then you'll start adjusting the tone. When you're using digital stuff, that's not really the process. You kind of have to think about the IR or speaker you're using first, because you don't want to play an amp and not hear a cabinet sound on there. So you're going to start with that, and then there's already kind of the master might be set in a position, and I notice a lot of people tend to go straight to the tone controls and gain rather than the master volume. And especially with modelers, I don't know why it is. Maybe it's just this kind of thing that's repeated online everywhere, where you have to crank the master to get an amp sounding right. And I think the tones that a lot of people look for is actually the master a lot lower, and it's not helpful that so many presets have the master just really high, and that can often skew people into not getting the tones they're looking for in digital stuff that maybe they'd be familiar with when using an amp, where you're not going to just blast the master as the first thing you do, as the first sound you hear.
Also, I think there's a completely different workflow to me. It's like having something delivered to you on a plate versus strapping yourself to a wild horse. That when I've moved to even synthesizers, for example, when I use an analog synthesizer, it's designed to make my hands want to do this. I'll do a take, and during the take, I'll be playing, and by the end of it, I'll have changed a setting halfway through the part. I don't do that in the box. In the box, I go preset, how does it sound, adjust it a little bit, record the part.
Absolutely. It's such a huge thing, and like I find it fascinating because we don't really understand all of why that is. But with plugins and analog emulations, I think it's so important they respect the way the hardware looks, that the knobs and the controls that are presented to the user, a lot of thought has gone into the design of equipment, whether it's an amplifier, whether it's 1176 or a channel strip or whatever. They've had to make a lot of design choices on what is presented to the user to use and what colors they've used for it, how big the knob is, where it is on the actual equipment itself. All these things are there to inform the user on. It gives them some boundaries of expectation on what it's supposed to do, how fast they're supposed to get there. All these things that inform how we use it, that if you strip away without really carefully considering it, you're going to lose what makes that equipment work in the first place. And as much as we want to capture the exact sound of it, there's an interactive tactile element that is fundamental to how we use it. That it might be on an amplifier that you have certain toggles on the front of it that are there because the user is supposed to adjust it in a moment, and other ones that are on the back where it might be more of a global thing that you don't adjust as often, or a certain knob or switch that there's a reason that it's not presented to the user in an obvious way, and that the controls that are there for a reason. And I think if those are changed or taken away in some way, the user is going to have a different experience of it. And it's kind of like with captures where you have one fixed setting, but you're not really having the experience of an amp. If you have a Mesa Mark amp, for example, it's kind of dialing it in is as much of the experience as actually playing it, because you're just kind of sailing between all these different modes and settings, which are all in front of you. And it's a very, very tactile experience of dialing it in, where having preset sounds of it, you'll have the sound of it, but you won't have that same experience of kind of fine tuning and honing in on something.
Like a different mode of engagement.
Yeah, for sure. And you know, how we feel about equipment does inform how we hear it as well. It just does. Like, we're not really conscious of how that is, but the way it looks, the kind of design of it, the controls that are there, how long we spend dialing it in, it is going to shape our perception of how that sounds. And yeah, we build these connections to what bands have used it before, how it looks, where we might have seen it on stage, these kind of memories that, oh, this is the amp that's used for that. So we're already expecting something out of it. If you don't have the way it looks in front of you and these particular controls in front of you, you don't have those same expectations, and you're not really going to get the same results, and you're going to end up somewhere totally different with it.
Yeah.
So I think it's, you know, it goes back to that thing of when I'm trying an amp out and trying to find what sounds to have, it's invaluable to have it in front of you. You can't really, even with a modeler that has all the same parameters and a perfect, let's say, emulation of it, it's just not the same thing as having it, the real thing in front of you there. And
do you, well, going the other way, because I mean, I think we're probably, you know, I don't want to reinforce my prejudices that I prefer my amp. Like, so people like me, for example, are there any misconceptions about modeling that you think are prevalent? So, you know, what's the biggest misconception that people have about amp captures?
I think we're naturally skeptical of technology being able to capture the magic of, I think especially like even studio gear, which the circuits might be quite a lot more basic, where they're designed to operate in a kind of linear fashion a lot of the time. They're not trying to distort, and if they do in a pleasant way, it's not really the intended purpose of an EQ or a preamp or compressor. They have very kind of fixed goals of what they're trying to do, and they can't really, gear that purposely misbehaves wouldn't be much use to anyone. You wouldn't really sell too much of it. Even if it sounds good in a moment, it wouldn't be reliable enough to use day to day and across different projects. So, you know, a lot of studio gear is kind of has fixed boundaries on what it's expected to do, whereas a guitar amp is kind of all about the chaos. You know, you have a gain control there, and you are purposefully overdriving tubes and clipping sections of the preamp, and you know, totally butchering the signal. You know, I think is in a Soldano, something like 95% of the signal gets dumped to ground, so it's doing so much shaping of it. So if we're skeptical of studio gear doing as good a job as analog, a guitar amp where there's so many non-linearities and distortion and kind of complex interactions happening, we are naturally going to be skeptical of it. And so I know a lot of people are kind of naturally going to think, oh, I don't know, it's going to sound a bit digital. I don't know if I want to do that. Let's just use the real thing, and you have that assurance of it. So I totally get why there's a skepticism towards using digital products generally. But I think the biggest barrier now isn't really the technology side of it. I think it's the user's understanding on how to get the sounds they're looking for out of it, because the process is so different to miking up a real guitar amp with a mic, where everything we know for that doesn't really apply to using any kind of digital models of it, no matter what the technology of the digital side is. So you kind of have to start from scratch again and just understand the process for getting it to sound the way we want it to. Which I think a lot of people, they're not really going to be willing to put the time into it. It's hard to say that it's really worth the investment of time unless you're determined to figure this stuff out and actually get to the bottom of it. And there's a lot of kind of, much like I was saying with the impulses and people making them in different ways, it's similar with the amp modeling, where very few offer you the ability to change the impedance behavior of the power amp with the cabinet. Most of the time that's fixed, and most of the time within that they don't tell you what load they've captured it under. So if you go into using a certain amp and you're used to it behaving under a certain load and the model is a different one, it's up to the user to understand why it's different, or why I don't know how aware of the subject you are there, but like there's through the YouTube channel I use to advertise my product, I've done a lot of comparisons where I'll show the real amp against various models, and sometimes it might be Tonex and NAM and Kemper and capturing platforms, and sometimes it might be plugins or Axe effects or Neural DSP or whatever. And I'll basically show these different platforms against the real amp and show hopefully how similar they can sound, and if there's differences, whether how close they are, how much differences matter, whether other people can hear it. A lot of the time they're blind tests, and the two areas for me that really stick out as kind of important areas for the general public to learn about to get the most out of modeling, it's the power amp and cabinet interaction that as guitarists we've never really had to understand. You just plug it in and the sound you get is the one you go with. I think with modelers you do kind of need to understand the influence that has, and we're only at I think we've only got to a point where that modeling has actually got really good. So I think understanding that is a kind of big part of getting the most out of digital. And then the whole input level debate, where I did a video, it matched my personality and the type of person I am, where I have to get to the bottom of understanding stuff. I can be really persistent and kind of unrelenting with getting to the bottom of things. I'll just typically go further than most people prepare to, for my shame. But I kind of went through this big project of messaging developers and trying to establish the reference level for their plugins, for their modeling. And all of this information wasn't being shared. And it's the same with, studio gear, like 1176s. If you use one by Waves and one by UAD and one by Plugin Alliance and one by IK, they all have a different reference point for what 1 volt is. And the reason they often sound different is because you're just driving them differently based on the level they've calibrated their model for. And most of the time we don't really need to worry about it. For studio gear, if you go in 6 dB hotter, the gear is going to behave roughly the same. You just drop the levels a bit and it's in that linear range where it's roughly going to be the same. If you push the extremes, you're going to notice a difference with it. But for the kind of typical operating range, it's not going to make a big difference. With a guitar amp, even 3 dB is going to make a drastic difference with it. So I think it matters for analog emulations for studio gear, but for guitar amps, if you want it to respond like the real thing, then it's just essential to have that locked in. And for the longest time, none of this information was available. Like, no plugin companies were saying, this is our definition for what 1 volt is. If you want to calibrate, then this is how you need to set it up. You'd be lucky if there's any mention of it at all. It was all kind of based off like peak levels of a guitar, which are a massive variable. You can't calibrate anything with with an instrument. There's a reason why you need a constant voltage to do that. So I did a video after I'd gone back and forth with a lot of different developers, just getting all the information I possibly could from all the kind of big manufacturers. And I'd put it in a spreadsheet and shared it online, and that gained a lot of traction and kind of opened this conversation up, which I say staggering, not because I'm surprised that no one knew. I'm surprised that we'd gone so long without this being a topic of conversation for people to dive into. And, that reached a lot of people, and so much of it was, I never realized that the plugin was actually good, but I was just feeding it a totally wrong level. And now that I've got the right level, now it actually sounds the way they intended it to, and we're getting good results with it. And that had all come off me making the same mistake. And I was dismissive of these digital technologies because I was using it wrong. I hadn't learned how to do it. And it required me to take these steps to learn why impulses might sound different or why apparent modeling might be different, and especially input levels. And if you don't have the right input level, then you're going to fall flat on everything else after that, because everything else is just skewed. It's like having an Instagram filter over your camera and not realizing. You might get results you like, but you're never actually getting the true representation of the source or how it's intended to be presented to the user. So, it comes across to some that I'm kind of really militant on this thing, and like from a creative point of view, I don't care at all. But from the perspective of there's these companies that have really smart developers that have dedicated their life to pursuing kind of accurate modeling, and they're putting their heart and soul into making really good models. The worst thing in the world to me is that they're releasing them and then users aren't experiencing it the way that they've designed it to be used. So I just think it involves the user to learn how to understand this stuff, and for developers to make the effort to share the information on how to get the best out of it and to make it accessible to users to understand. Because maybe I'm privileged that I get to work with equipment every day, and I've spent years doing the nerdy, geeky deep dives into things and A/B tests and reading schematics and things. Most people aren't going to do that, and there needs to be something where users can get predictable results, so they hear the way I've intended it to sound, they can hear what I'm shooting for with it, and that their starting point is kind of just like common sense and simple, and they don't really have to clear any hurdles to get there with it.
Yeah, great. I think I might hand over to Austin. We've still got a few more questions, and I don't want to keep you all day.
Yeah. So Ed, can we just spin back one thing actually about the kind of selection of amplifiers? So when you're kind of deciding which amplifiers to profile, you're kind of curating, your collection of amplifiers. The sort of decision-making process behind whether you profile a kind of modded Marshall, is that any different? So let's say you could say, okay, well, why am I capturing this modded Marshall over a JCM800, or why am I capturing this modded Marshall over a Friedman or a Bogner, for example? Is there any sort of like decision process where you decide that these are worth capturing over the other captures or profiles that are out there that are doing the similar job?
Yeah. I mean, with the Marshalls, it's a great place to start. So I guess because I'm passionate about Marshall anyway, and because they're so available, they've been around years. If I see a rare Marshall come up for sale, almost just for like documenting and kind of archiving these rare amps, I'm curious to experience them for myself anyway, but then Marshall are 10 minutes away from me and have like an amazing service department where I can take it to them, they can check over it, make sure it's stock and in the condition it needs to be. And then, I'd hope eventually someone comes along and does it in more depth than I do it. But if I can capture what I feel represents the amp and gives results that I love, then that's there forever. And whatever happens to the amp, if someone mods it into something totally different down the line, or it gets burnt down in a house fire or something, it's still accessible for people to use and to share with others that maybe don't have some of these rare Marshalls that we might come across a bit more easy, being local to the company. So as a starting point, I love that I can take an amp to Marshall and they can verify that it's stock, they can have it in its kind of optimal condition, and then I can capture it knowing with that reassurance that this is how it's intended to behave. And then the modding stuff, I guess, comes from where do you go beyond that? I think there's obviously the whole modding scene, which, I'm fascinated and really interested in as well. And that's kind of purposefully going beyond what the stock amps were ever designed to do. So as far as capturing them, it really depends on what the mod is there to do in the first place. If it's there to give it more gain or more bass or change the voicing or to add clipping diodes, I'll try and highlight what those differences are. A really kind of simple, borderline whether to even call it a mod, but like the Soldano hot mod and the legendary tones, the newer versions of it, that's kind of the simplest way of going from where you have the stock amp and you want to cater to that, and then you cater captures for what the amp's like with that in there and how that changes things, and you want to highlight where that's adding more gain, where it changes the way the tone stack behaves, where you might set the master volume slightly differently. Those would be the amps where you kind of have the connection to the stock circuit and where it goes beyond that. When it goes to something like a Bogner or 5150 or something that's gone through several iterations past where Marshall were with it, usually via the SLO. But with those, typically for me, it's because they've ended up on famous albums that have a guitar sound that I like the sound of, and they've kind of earned their place in in the kind of cultural significance. I think it's cool to have the more experimental amp designs, but they don't really appeal to me in the same way as something that has been on a famous recording or been used by someone in some kind of context. So the kind of commercially made amps that are derived from Marshalls, it's typically because they've been used somewhere that has been interesting to me or that's done something significant, which I think in a more general sense, they're the amps that we tend to fall in love with. It's not just because they offered an extra channel or something. It's because it was used on this album and I love the sound of it, or this album reminds me of when I was 16, or it's those kind of emotional connections to it that make us fall in love with the amp as much as the actual sound of it themselves. And I think my favorite amps of all time are the 203, and then I'll always bring up rectifiers as well. And rectifiers are fascinating from the kind of amp designer point of view, because amp designers hate them for the PCBs, the schematics being bad. There's so many, the components being underrated spec wise for what they're intended to do. There's so many things that could have been designed better for them, which totally makes sense. It's a totally rational way of kind of looking at those amps. And then on the other side, you have this kind of emotional connection to them, where every single significant album for 20 years probably has a rectifier on it. And you can't avoid all these huge bands that have used it on famous recordings that we're falling in love with, and if you want that sound, you kind of need that. So the rational part of me wants to hate the amplifier for being a nightmare for maintenance, and they cost twice as much to get serviced, and they're more prone to going wrong, and they vary between different revisions, and none of it's documented well. And the emotional part of your brain is like, yeah, but I love how it sounds, and that's the sound I fall in love with. So I wouldn't have bought a rectifier based on, it's kind of derived from an SLO and it's got these particular mods and these features. It's totally about, it's made these sounds, I want to sound like this is inspired a certain way of playing guitar or achieving something, and it's completely that aspect that I'm coming from.
So you kind of I guess that a lot of the reasons that you capture amps is to do with kind of nostalgic value, cultural reasons, a bit of heritage in there as well. You said you want to kind of capture these things as they exist and preserve them through your capture. Just going to the last couple of questions now, in terms of maybe your reputation within the field, what do you think kind of creates credibility within kind of amp profilers, vendors, and how would you say customers know how to trust? Because there's loads of profiles out there and loads of captures out there, loads of people selling things, and I think some people are even just selling Kemper captures and they're capturing them with Tonex and putting them out there that they're actual capture amps and so on. So how do people know who to trust, and they know that they're actually going to get the authentic sound of that amp from?
It's definitely a big thing, because I think what sounds good might not necessarily be from a real amp, even if you don't know. So there has to be this element of trust that what you're providing to users is what you say it is. And I think even these days, with the platforms offering so much for free, if you're going to present something that's for sale, you're essentially curating something. You're not just offering the amplifier, the sound of the amplifier, which people can probably get for free somewhere. You're kind of curating the experience they get, and they can have something verifiable and consistent, where if someone buys something from me, they know it's going to be an amp DI. It's kind of dialed in the way I normally do it. It's going to sound good with the IRs that I make. There's kind of parameters on it that if you just download random ones online, they're going to use varying input levels. There's going to be various loads used with it. There's no guarantee it's going to play nicely with the IRs I've used. The intention it's not going to align with the things that I go for when I make something. So part of what I offer is that kind of trust and consistency in what someone gets. It's going to be the same no matter what product I make with it. And then part of building the trust, it wasn't really a conscious thing. Like the whole reason I got into making IRs and captures of amps, it was more for my own personal use, that no one was really offering. I couldn't find anyone who was making Kemper profiles of just amplifiers. If you were lucky, you might get one or two thrown in, but that was never the focus for anyone making Kemper profiles. So it just seemed like something where I was making them already for my own use and no one was offering it. So I thought, well, it makes sense to offer these to other people. And the same thing was true with the cabinet impulses, where everyone just had their own approach with it and none were quite what I was looking for with it. So the goal for me was all about recreating the actual sound of a mic'd cabinet in the room and being able to verify that when you use an amp and a load box, it's the same as when you mic up normally, and accounting for those load differences, just being aware of all that stuff. And there was maybe one or two that were close, but they didn't offer all the mic positions that I wanted. They didn't offer every single speaker within the cab. Just things that I was typically doing when I was in the studio. And if I was trying to recreate that digitally, no one had it on offer. Or if they did, something else was missing from it. So it's kind of, the whole thing wasn't me coming up with a business idea. It was, I made them for my own personal use because no one else was offering that at all. And when I had, well, I felt like I had something unique, a unique perspective on it that was different to what other people were offering, it just made sense to make that available. And a big part for me is that they're not just what sounds good, it's accurate to the source. That really matters to me. I'm passionate about amps and circuits and kind of preservation of things. And I care about the whole studio process as well. It's a kind of sacred process to go into that. So I think I don't want to cut corners on things or have something similar but not quite the same. I really want it to translate. So even before I was selling things and posting things online with my friends who do recording and are in the industry as well, is we were sending each other tests and saying which one sounds more accurate, this one or this one. And I had all these comparison tests on my hard drive just from things from my own kind of R&D essentially. And it gets quite hard to find where they are. It just kind of made sense to post them online and just share it. And that kind of led into me just posting these things on YouTube where they're the most minimum effort things possible. I'm just literally throwing it online so I can find it later. And I guess it's just interesting for other people to hear these comparison tests between this is amp and load box, this is a mic'd up amp and cab. You know, does it sound the same? Is there differences? What are the differences? And then same with the modelers. And that's kind of ended up being quite a useful, I use the term marketing generally because it's not like a conscious marketing thing. It's just, this is what I'm doing. This is the trust. When I make an amp capture that it sounds like the real amp, I want to show that this is what the real amp sounds like and this is what the model sounds like. Mostly for my own benefit. I wouldn't put anything out there. I wouldn't even use it myself if it wasn't accurate. But you know, over time, posting these comparison tests and demonstrating how I use them and how to get results that give a certain sound, what to expect from them. It's really important to show that stuff anyway, but that's kind of been the thing that has built trust with customers. They can hear how I'm using it, the kind of results I get, how to get the most out of it. You know, once that's demonstrated to people, I think they can hear, oh, this actually does sound the way the real amp does, and should be a reasonable starting off point to gain their trust as customers.
Cool. And last question. Anything surprised you about doing all of this? What have you learned about profiling that you just didn't expect once you started it? What's the biggest surprising thing you found about doing all of this stuff?
I guess the human perception part of it and how flawed we are as listeners, where we can think one day it's perfect and the next day it's awful, when the reality is somewhere in that kind of grey area. And the grey area, I guess, is where all the interesting stuff happens anyway. So between kind of just learning to listen critically and kind of find some middle ground on where a line actually is, because as good as the technology is, I think it's absolutely incredible and probably better than a lot of people realize. It's still not perfect, and I'm still not sure it ever will be, because we have this tactile aspect of using real gear and an emotional connection to physical gear and to real valves and real circuits. And I'm not sure that can ever be fully approximated with digital gear, but it's been fascinating to kind of discover what the limitations of technology are and what limitations are from the kind of human side, and how we navigate those hurdles of, you know, technology is so good now, and we really are just closing in on that final percent on things. And if we're being honest, the biggest hurdle is how it's presented to users, and that's already coming with the kind of parametric models and vibe coding and all this stuff that's making things accessible to almost anyone to make models of whatever they want.
So Ed, just to clearly differentiate between two things, when you say the tactile experience, do you mean how the amp feels under the fingers, or do you mean actually being able to reach out and tweak the controls, having the amp
totally there? Like touching the controls and touching the physical amp circuit, where there's a voltage going in and an audio signal going in and out, and where it's just something that you can touch the gear and you can modify the circuit, and depending on what valve you put in it or what voltage goes into it, something different will come out of it. And there's something about that whole experience that changes how we use it. And it's very hard to approximate with digital. I don't even know if it is possible. I think the whole mindset when you go in with digital, you're coming from a totally different place with different intentions. And, if we use plugins as an example, part of the appeal of using it is that you don't have to commit to the sound of it. It's there where you can adjust things as you go. You can change it after the fact. You go in with this mentality of it's not a fixed captured thing, which is very different to when you're miking up a guitar amp, where you kind of have to get it right at the source. You go in with an intention of this is what we're trying to achieve. Let's get it right before we proceed further with it. And it kind of informs all these other decisions that come afterwards, which across the process of recording, it must be millions of micro decisions like that add up. So I don't know if it's really possible to recreate that whole experience of dialing an amp in, moving a microphone, plugging in different cabs, moving it around the room.
Can I just ask one?
Yeah,
I know Dan's going to ask one. Can I just ask one while it's on my tongue? Imagine that someone took NAM and they did one of these parametric captures and they put it in an amp head and they sold it. So literally when you're tweaking the pots, they're not actually pots now, but when you're tweaking the bass, middle, treble, gain, everything, it really behind the scenes, it's just a parametric NAM capture. Do you think that would solve the problem then? So effectively it's just a load of captures in an amp head. So we got this user experience where they're being able to touch things and so on. And it looks like an amp, functions exactly like an amp, but there's no valves in it or anything. It's whatever, just a little Raspberry Pi.
I think it would solve some problems.
Yeah.
I think part of the thing with real amps is the unpredictable nature of them. And when you do push into those limits, and so I think hypothetically you'd need a parametric NAM model to misbehave in all the same ways that a real amp would, where the voltage might affect how it's responding or changing the load, which is all possible to do if they really went to town on making a digital model of it. But it does become more and more kind of far-fetched because all the level of detail you need to go in with it, where someone might fall in love, like one of my favorite Marshalls, the valves aren't fully behaving, but it just sounds great, so you go with it. I don't know if I'd want to make a NAM capture of that because it's a little bit noisy, it's a bit unpredictable, but it has something that is cool. And I think a digital model isn't really ever going to get into that grey area of stuff that isn't quite behaving quite right. I think, though, the tactile aspect of it is, it would solve a lot of the kind of process of when people plug into an amp, the way they set the controls, the way if they talk to a venue and things sound a bit different, they can get to a familiar point in a much easier way than they would with bending over on the floor and kind of going through menus and things like that. And to be honest, we've had like Soft Tube did that amp with Marshall where the preamp was all digital and it had a valve power amp. And I know some amp techs that absolutely love it. They think it's absolutely incredible and like much better than people realize. And the product line kind of tanked. It was almost the right product at the wrong time and kind of thrown in a mix of other products they were making, and it didn't really get much attention and just kind of fell by the wayside. And I think the climate for it now would probably be way more receptive to it, and it would solve a lot of problems that people have where it kind of offers the convenience of digital, but with the simplicity and expectations that you'd get from a real amp. And like Fender do those Tone Master amps now, which fully digital inside, but they have the look and kind of sound and response of the real amps, and that seems to be doing quite well for them. And I really wouldn't be surprised if Marshall follows suit with something similar. I think there is. It seems like it's even down to the physical weight of it, that people don't want to be lugging heavy guitar amps in. If they're doing gigs, they want something they can just load in the car easily and that's kind of not going to put their back out, not too big.
Not too late though.
Not too late though.
No, but like for me, it's not really the things I want for in a digital amp. I want all the like unpredictable chaos, the inconvenient noise and
Bit
size.
lopsided when you take the head and the transformers on one side and it tips over to that side.
Yeah, I want as much of that as possible. But I think that's not really what sells. And for most users, when they want a kind of digital version of an amp, they want it lighter, they want it not to break, and it's maybe a different design brief. But
I think that's kind of the Boss Katana design brief. Smaller, cheaper, lighter, and it's the most popular amp in the world.
That might be the Katana 3 that I've just described, possibly. It could be what they're working on right now. Who knows, you know?
And each year they're better and better, but they still look like katanas to me.
Yeah, I agree. They're not something you fall in love with. They're convenient, but there's some kind of emotional trade-off that you're always thinking about. It sounds like this. You're comparing it to something else.
I bought one for home playing, and I now use the power amp with NAM captures. Or sorry, Tonex. I've got a little Tonex one pedal, and I just do the DI captures and just run it through the Katana power amp for just home playing. I think it sounds pretty good, to be honest, for what it is. Nice. You know.
Yeah.
I feel like Fender did catch the trick that everybody was missing, which is those Fender digital amps look beautiful.
Definitely. I think the way it looks is it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier, that it's not just the sound of it. We like to think that we're kind of rational and we just respond to the sound, and the way it looks wouldn't matter to us, but it does. And you think of the Marshall, was it the Studio series, the little 20-watt ones? They sold really well because they look like things that people want to have in their living room. It looks like the amps they've dreamed of. And I mean, I'd say it's debatable whether they're actually a convenient volume for a lot of them. They're still pretty loud.
I have two of them. Three. And they are not quiet amps.
No. 21 amps loud, isn't it? 4-watt amps loud for bedroom levels, isn't it? You know.
Definitely, yeah. But I think it really does matter how it looks, the controls you have on it. It feels familiar to what you expect from those amps, and that is such a big part of why you would gravitate towards it in the first place, and to get the results you expect out of it. It's why you'd pick an 800 over a 959 or JCM45. There's all those visual clues that are there that are kind of important to preserve, I think.
There's a thing that keeps coming through every time you talk that I'm fascinated by, and I think of it as something that's common in like obsessive engineers. And it comes through in exactly what you just talked about there, about the concept of falling in love with an amp and falling in love with it, not just because of its perfection, but because of its imperfection, because of its visual, because of its tactile. But there's a level that I think you're talking about here that just says love and care, that respect for the studio traditions that brought you here, respect for all of these. And I always remember working with a mix engineer a little while ago, and there was one song we spent a little while, another one we did a quick recording, and I remember him saying to me that the second one didn't sound like it had as much love and care put into the production, and that's always stuck with me as something that seems to be coming across with what you're saying. I was just thinking to wrap up with this, but there are a couple of questions. One is around how do you feel about that? I keep feeling like engineers are fighting between the concepts of what they love and what they're told is convenient and expedient. And I as an academic researcher, as someone who's done 25 years of recording bands, it really pisses me off. There is convenience and expedient. My home setup is full of like, if I plug this in really quickly, but a lot of it's still analog, almost more for convenience, because reaching and grabbing a knob is quicker than flipping between windows. But how do you feel about that? And just sort of, I really want to push back on some of the narrative, and the reason the Marshall Modification Project is so exciting to me is it is about love and care and weird, quirky things, and not about how do we do this as quickly and conveniently as possible, because I feel like convenience is starting to be something that conceptually aggravates me. I'll leave that out there and let you ramble about that as well.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, So I mix and master for a living, and the whole process of that is probably informed my brain to think in a certain way when I'm doing things where um, I'd describe it even amongst my kind of peers. I'm very technically minded with things anyway. I like to learn and explore things and really understand why things do what they do. But when I'm working on things, it's almost I'm trying to forget all of that technical stuff, and I'm just trying to like let the song speak to me and kind of go off the emotion and the feel of it and let that dictate what I'm doing. And all the technical things I'm doing behind that kind of subconscious, instinctive moves that outside of the actual work, I've done my homework and understanding. But when it comes to actually communicate music, it's based on the feeling it gives you and what the artist's intention is with it. And there's this kind of like artistic approach with it, because that's the reason it exists in the first place. That's the reason why anyone else is going to fall in love with it. And I think that translates to loads of things in my life that I just approach in a similar way. If I'm cooking or making coffee or whatever, it's this kind of like obsessive refinement of understanding it, but then also to just enjoy it for what it is and take it for what it is, and not to, to understand the technical side, but then to know when that's just serving something else. And it's an easy thing to trip up with across all kinds of music production and gear. And I love gear as much as the next person, but there has to be a point to why we're using it and why it's there in the first place. And you don't want that to be dictating the other side of it. It always has to be the art that dictates the technology, rather than technology kind of dictating the art, as far as I'm concerned with it. Or at least when I'm...
It's mildly amusing that every person who said, oh, the technology doesn't matter too much, is always sitting in front of a lot of technology.
Yeah. I think, like you were saying, it is inspiring to be sat around gear and to have that tactile thing. It makes us more connected to the music. We land on things we might not have otherwise. I know if I mix something all with stock Pro Tools plugins, it's going to sound the same as if I do it on a Neve desk, because I'm still responding to the music in the same way. I'm still reacting to it. I'm still trying to achieve the same outcome on the song. It's just how I get there is slightly different. But the process I take will be totally different based on which approach I take with it. There is something that affects how we interpret the music and how we respond to it and what we focus on. And it is different. Like we can't control that. We can't just do it in the same way regardless of how we work. It is this kind of fundamental difference that's there. But I am trying not to let the gear dictate me. I'm trying to feed off the inspiration of what I'm hearing and let that dictate where we're going with it. And I think the whole kind of passion and love for music has to be there. It's the reason why we all play an instrument in the first place. It's the reason why we work on it and why we pour so much time and kind of attention into it. It's not just a kind of means to an end and trying to tick boxes or something. There's something deeper that we get out of it. And it's kind of like reassuring that Gen Z seems to be so into buying physical media and to be kind of rejecting convenience. Maybe not for the same reasons that we traveled through it. Well, we've chosen convenience and kind of generations older than them, but it is easier to connect with physical things and for there to be a limited supply of them and to not have the same thing presented to everyone around the world, where someone in a certain town might have access to certain instruments or certain amps or certain albums that is different to someone in another town, and there's a kind of scarce number of them. I think the convenience has diluted things down. It's changed how we there's like even a societal kind of cultural thing with it, where so much music these days is made by looking over your shoulder and looking what other people are doing and trying to match that. And I think there needs to be a kind of shift almost back towards people going against it and trying to do their own thing, find their own niche with it. And it's where modded amps do have their own distinct personality, and where even unmodded amps that are just slightly different to one another through aging or kind of component tolerances, they do make it more unique, and it offers something that is different to what is easily accessible to millions of people.
Well, I feel like that's a really good place to end things.
Not
quite.
Not quite. Got
one
last question that will end things, that brings.
Oh well, we've done it again. We've done the first goodbye.
One last question that will bring it all back together, which is kind of ties this whole interview, I guess, together, because obviously it's about Marshall modifications. How do you think, if at all, captures change the way people experience and understand Marshall modifications? What do you think? I think we preserve them or reinterpret them or do something else?
No, it's made different amps so much more accessible to everyone. And I think when I was growing up, like no one had Bogners or Friedmans, or they weren't really even a thing so much. When I was growing up, the kind of amps had evolved into the sort of VH4 and Marshall JVM, where 4 channels, loads of effects loops, loads of features kind of crammed into an amp. And since then, it's kind of pivoted back a bit towards more simple amplifiers with modifications on there. So I think the kind of design of amps has changed a bit over the last few years, and there's been a bit of just things are way more accessible than they used to be. I think going from where there was bigger companies making amps to a lot more people, it's now more boutique amps selling to a kind of crowd of irrational but passionate customers, where there is a market for these kind of boutique amp brands to do modified versions of amps, and then captures have meant that anyone in the world can play through them and hear roughly what they sound like. Maybe not get the full experience, but they'll get a feel for what distinguishes a Soldano from a Friedman, from a Bogner, or from one of Jason Tong's amps. You get an idea of what that's actually like to play, where 20, 30 years ago or longer, you wouldn't have really been able to experience that without playing one in person. And to play one in person, you might have to fly around the planet to even be in the same room as one. So it's made it way more accessible to even get a feel for if you want to play through a Wizard or all these kind of really expensive, rare boutique amps. And, for the rare Marshalls as well that people just won't come across. Everything is so accessible now where you can get a feel from it. And I don't see it as a replacement for just because you can play through a diesel capture or a Wizard capture, you're now not going to buy one. I think, if anything, it's either going to be that you wouldn't have bought one anyway, and now your curiosity is kind of satisfied, or you're going to just fall in love with that sound and think, okay, I need to find the real thing now and experience that, because I think the capture is that good that I want to play it in my rehearsal space or with my band, or take it on the road with me, or take it to the studio. I want the full experience of what it's like to actually play. And I don't think you can really capture the full experience with just a digital model of it. It gives you a taste, it gives you something through a particular lens of that amp, but it's not the same experience as having the actual amp. And I think, if anything, it will make people more interested in what these differences are, much in the way that it made me more interested in different amp circuits, different amplifiers. You get to find what you like, and you can learn more about who created it, why they did it, what those changes are, what differentiates it, and it will make people more passionate about different amp designs and circuits. And there's a kind of fear that you think these amp techs getting older and older, and who's going to be the younger generation that carries on all their kind of accumulated knowledge, and who's going to keep buying valves and keep these factories going. And I think a lot of the capture tech has made people more interested in amps again, because it's made it available, made people more interested out there. There's a platform for Dave Friedman to have these panel discussions, and Jason Tong and Monomyth and Dan Gower. They're kind of becoming voices and mini celebrities in a kind of bubble that wasn't there before. And it's kind of reassuring and fascinating that there's this platform now that didn't exist 20, 30 years ago.
Do you think, just last question, promise. Obviously, mods were a big thing in the 80s, and then obviously when the Soldano came out, Mesa Boogie, it became less, important and not really something that many guitar players were really discussing anymore. And then there's a bit of a resurgence around mods. Do you think the captures have had anything to do with that at all?
I think in a way it has helped a lot, because you think the Kemper sold absolutely bucket loads of units. Same with Tonex. NAM has an unbelievable number of users out there. So these are people that might not have heard of the kind of boutique amp brands, and the way those captures are, they are kind of addictive, because it's so available just to click through different things, and you can you can very quickly audition a lot of different amp types. And if all they had access to was the same old amps they find in their local guitar shop, you'd kind of quickly get bored of things. And I think it has meant people are looking for the rare, the expensive, the boutique, the modified, the kind of the variations of things. And it's been a starting off point for a lot of people, I think, to find that thing that's different and unique or desirable in some way. And I mean, I think there's a number of reasons why these boutique kind of brands and modded, or amp modders in general, have had more of a platform. I think partly, social media has a big part to play in giving them a means to access customers that before they've had to go through distributors and guitar stores to get their stuff out there, and they need a totally different model to what it is now. And I think, we're in a climate where it is possible for them to sell directly to users, to modify things to a user's specs, to tweak things, on an individual basis that wasn't really possible before. So I don't think captures have really, I wouldn't say they're the sole driver in it, but for sure the number of people that are using captures has meant that people are looking for way more different amps and kind of exploring what's out there.
Cool, thanks for that, Ed. Dan, do you have a last question, or are we done?
No, I'm conscious of the fact that we'll end up keeping you all day, and that
I love talking about stuff. So.
You have amp capturing work to do, and I guess one question might actually be is, how has being an amp capture expert transformed your business?
It's always boring to go back to pandemic stuff again, but that did kind of change how people were working a lot. And so I'm mixing and mastering, day to day, and a lot of the time, so I'm coming in at the end of the projects typically, and I'll send mixes off, and there might be a bit of a wait to get feedback, depending on how many people it's got to pass through. Sometimes it's just direct with the artist and communication is quite quick. Other times there's people at label, there's managers, A&R people, different producers involved. Sometimes it might have to go through several stages of people before I get all the notes I need to carry on or finish working or print stems or whatever. So it's quite normal for there to be time where I'm working in a kind of mad, crazy rush, and then gaps in between where I'm not doing as much. I'm just waiting for someone else to send me some files or give me notes or ask whatever stems they need. So that pandemic period just sort of meant I was sat with some time on my hands between jobs while I was waiting on things, not really wanting to start another project in the middle of ongoing things, but also where I could just blast through making some IRs or make some captures of amps. And I guess in that period, it was quite a appealing time to be buying amps as well. There was just great deals and stuff, and it's kind of where things got very much out of control for me, buying amps and cabs and diving into it, because I just had time to experiment and learn about circuits and modify things and learn about all this stuff. So without that extra time on my hands, I wouldn't have really had the opportunity to learn about all these interactions and how to create things that I was happy with. And then since then, it really is just something that is convenient for me to fill the gaps in the calendar that kind of come up naturally, because I like to be available to take on jobs at short notice. It's just the nature of what I do, where I don't get a lot of warning when mix and mastering jobs come up and they need it done yesterday. So I'd rather be available to do things like that, where if I have a couple of hours in the morning to create something, and if I need to stop suddenly and do something else, that's absolutely fine. It's not like where I have clients in the room and where I'd have to find a way out of it. That wouldn't really be an option for me. So it's been something that's convenient for me to just sort of chip away at in my own time. I can use my studio and equipment and knowledge and skills I already have for day-to-day work that applies to making these. And then once they're online, they can kind of, I have to do a little bit of work as far as making demos and showing the products and helping customers, but it fits in with what I'm doing anyway, and they can kind of sell themselves online somewhat as a passive thing once the products are made and demonstrated. So it's kind of a good match for what I'm doing anyway. It's not, I know there's a lot of creators that is their full-time job and that's what they do 9 to 5 every day. For me, it's kind of adapting what I'm doing day to day and kind of putting a few passions and skills into one. And I'd like to think that my perspective and what I offer is something that appeals to certain customers that are looking for that kind of studio mentality with it, and someone who kind of cares about the original design of amps and capturing them as an accurate kind of focused way. And I'd say that's kind of maybe, I can't speak for every creator out there. There's for sure some that maybe have a similar background to me, but I know a lot come from a more guitarist orientated background, or maybe they're trying to cater to a live crowd, or maybe they just want all-in-one type presets where the cabinet's already mic'd up and the user has less options, which is totally appealing to some people. But I've kind of purposefully avoided trying to offer things that other people are already doing. I want to do what I do well.
Great. I think that's. I think we're done. And Ed, we maybe should do the kind of podcasty thing. Can you tell everybody where they can get your stuff?
Sure. Easiest way is to just Google Mirror Profiles. I have a Shopify website that you'll find easy. My YouTube account, I have a Mirror Profiles one, but most I do under Ed S. And again, it should be easy to find. There's all kinds of amp comparisons and demonstrators of IRs, and I do my best to try and link the ones I've used in there. A lot of the time, I'm just going off the comparison aspects of it. I'm not trying to sell things, but if that appeals to people, it's a good way for them to hear it. And it's quite hard to find examples of digital gear sounding the same as real mic'd up amps, and that's been a bit of a niche that I offer. So as much as visiting the website, I think YouTube's just a great place to explore these different sounds and for people to hear it. And if they connect with the sounds I make, then they can follow to the website.
Cool. Well, so if they look for Mirror Profiles, Tonex, Kemper, and Google, they'll find you.
We'll put the links in the description as well.
Yeah. Cool.
Of course.
Okay, Ed, thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. We got lots of information, complete treasure trove on the mindset of a profiler. So thanks so much, Ed. Cheers.
Cheers. It's been a pleasure. I love chatting with you guys.
Good, Ed. Thanks again.
Okay.